I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your counsellor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest global executive panel from VLGA and LGIU. My name is Chris Eddy, and I'm delighted to have you joining us from all corners of the globe this evening for our discussion about taking climate action in a time of permacrisis. I'll introduce our panel to you in just a moment. But firstly, I would like to, on behalf of the VLGA and LGIU, acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. Now, throughout the course of our session this evening, please feel free to add your questions and comments for our presenters in the Q&A function that you'll see on your screen. We will endeavour to get through as many of those questions throughout our session tonight, as many as time allows. The chat function is also open for any commentary or discussion during the course of our panel session. On behalf of the VLGA, the Counsellor Support Network in Victoria, and LGIU, which is operating across the globe, we welcome you all to tonight's panel. I would like to say a quick hello to each of our speakers. Joining us tonight, we have Dr. Jessica Stella, who is the Assistant Director for Reef Health at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, and we're delighted to have Jess with us. Good evening, Jess. Also,
good evening, Chris.
Thank you. Joan Martin is joining us all the way from Ireland. Joan is the CEO of Louth County Council. It's good morning to you, Joan.
Afternoon and evening to everybody all over the globe, and thanks very much, Chris, for supporting us here this morning.
Lovely to have you with us. We also have Professor Joan Thwaites, who is the chair of Climateworks, the chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and well known as a former Deputy Premier in the state of Victoria and the First Minister for Climate Change, not just in Victoria, but in Australia. John, good evening and welcome to you.
Good evening, Chris.
Great to have you here. And our first speaker I'll introduce to you now is the CEO at Aberdeen City Council in Scotland. It's Angela Scott, who is no stranger to our audience, having participated in one of our panels in the past. Angela has been the Chief Executive of Aberdeen City Council since 2014, and prior to that was the Director of Corporate Governance. She was previously the head of the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and an expert advisor to both the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. She was also a vice chair of the Scottish Health Board. During her tenure at Aberdeen, the city has undergone significant regeneration, adopting a new operating model to transform services and deliver required savings of £125 million. Looking forward to hear Angela's presentation this evening. Angela, good evening or good morning to you and welcome.
Thank you, Chris, and it was good morning here from Scotland, and good afternoon to those colleagues that are joining us. I'm going to just try and rattle through some slides, Chris, if that's okay, and
yes,
try and stick to time. Just to give a context for the framework within which we are operating as a city. We have our own net zero route map, our own adaptation framework for the city. I have my own institutional plans for climate change as well. All of that is done within the context of a legislative framework that comes from our devolved government here in Scotland that has set some slightly different targets than the UK government. And then, of course, we operate within the UK framework and legislative framework of the Climate Change Act, all of which then sits obviously underneath the global framework. So all of that is the framework that's kind of sitting above us as a city. Very briefly, in terms of the context of the city, I wanted to just share some of the impacts that we are seeing as a result of climate change and the progress that we are making on our emissions. So first slide here is evidencing the progress that has been made, but frighteningly, I guess, the scale of the journey to go between now 23 and the critical targets of 2030. Again, you'll all be familiar the impacts that the weather and climate change is having on us as a city. This was the impact of Storm Arwen for us, winds that battered us here in the north of Scotland. Again, we've got two rivers and we're on the coast, so we've got rising sea level, which is clearly bringing a pressure on our coastal line, and also in terms of rivers bursting their banks. Rainfall kind of pressure, again, you'll be familiar with all of this and how we respond to that as a council. Temperatures, again, we're in the north of Scotland, historically been pretty cold up here, but we are getting unbelievably hot. We've just come out of a heat wave, and as Scottish people, we are certainly not designed for coping with decent temperatures, so we're all struggling with that. But it's challenging for us as an institution because we were geared up for our winter response was largely about snow. It's not now. It's now about rain and winds and how we cope with that. In response to the changing impact of climate change, we've produced the Aberdeen Adapts framework. This is the latest version of that in 2022. Gives you a sense of all of the stakeholders that we have kind of corralled within the city to be a part of that Aberdeen Adapts framework. Gives you just a flavour for the work that we are trying to prioritise, both in terms of our buildings and infrastructure, flooding and coastal, which is a clear pressure given we've got two rivers and we're on the coast. Natural environment, again, how we support our businesses, in particular in a city centre where we are being impacted by floods and what that's doing to local businesses as well, and helping, I guess, the community to understand the impact of climate change. Again, just showing the kind of like strategic partnerships that we're forming, one in particular with the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, a sustainable growth agreement between ours and ourselves, how we actually work together to really build our nature-based solutions in order to hold the water, because our pressure is the flooding water is going into the sewer system and the pressure that's bringing. So we're working with Scottish Environment Protection Agency around how we can invest in nature-based solutions to keep the water above the ground. So in addition to our Aberdeen Adapts, we've got a route map for achieving net zero. Again, this is a city-wide route map. It's not the city council, and I deliberately make that distinction. They are not the same thing. But again, the government placed a duty on local government here in Scotland to produce these route maps for achieving net zero for the entirety of a place. No small challenge to produce that. The route map is underpinned by, again, a number of partners that are part of signing up to the net zero framework. The route map itself is underpinned by 6 enabling strategies: building and heat, mobility, energy supply, circular economy, natural environment, and a kind of behaviour empowerment strategy. And all of those enabling strategies are designed to underpin the achievement of that route map. A lot of work done to produce this, a leadership board that comprised public and private that authored all of these plans, and they all sit coherently together. Gives you a bit of a flavour for what the strategic objectives are across the 6 strategies. We are trying to, as a council, play very specific roles within these strategies, but we're saying it's not all down to us. We don't have the capacity to do anything. But certainly if I looked at the mobility strategy, for example, we are driving forward the active travel agenda. If I looked at the circular economy, we are definitely working hard around waste generation and the reuse and the repair and the recycle agenda. Even in the energy supply, I've got a joint venture with BP. We're working to produce a hydrogen production centre in the city, so green hydrogen. We're trying to push that forward. So we have a very distinct role to play in these enabling strategies, but doing all of this in partnership. So again, these just give you a flavour for each of those strategies, but I'll just keep going. Belinda, colleagues can see the data. We've invested significantly in a hydrogen fleet, for example. Next slide. Again, we've got an extensive heat network in the city linked to our new energy from waste plants, again in the space that we're in. Scotland's about to get a circular waste bill that's coming forward. We're building, as a council, we've been building that energy from waste plant, if it just keep going. Again, this private and public partnership in terms of the energy transition campus, we are definitely trying to, and again, Aberdeen's unique in the context, our economy is being based on fossil fuel. And so not only are we doing a place transition environmentally, Chris, but we've actually got to do an economic transition as well. And so all of this work here that's being a partnership between public and private sector is about how we will absolutely support the city's transition economically, exploiting the expertise around hydrogen and offshore wind as well. This is again an example of how we're working public and private, the joint venture that the City Council has with BP. Again, just an example of the strategies. If I keep going, thank you, Belinda. And a pledge, I'm sure you've all done this again, just trying to get everybody to make the commitment and trying to do that not just through organisations but through individuals as well and groups of community. So this is again just an example of economically how we're trying to transition. Scottish Government did what's called the ScotWind leasing round, and that's all around the Crown estate that surrounds Scotland and how we're using that to absolutely exploit wind farms and the significant expansion of that. And again, given our geographical location, we have no shortage of wind. So again, how we're trying to diversify the energy system. What I wanted to just finally show is just the collaboration. So that's the collaboration within the city between public and private. The Scottish Cities Alliance is an alliance that's made up of the 8 cities in Scotland, and to date we've been attempting to work together, again recognising that from a funding and investment point of view, Chris, none of us were going to have the money to support all of the investment, and actually if there was scope to aggregate our demand as eight cities, then the market might be more interested in that. So to date we've been trying to work together on agendas like transport, waste, and so on. Much of the themes that are within my own city strategy as well. We've been trying to do work particularly around data, and again understanding the data that needs to be collected. We've been trying to work together on ensuring climate emergency skills. We've been trying to support the peer-to-peer learning, both in terms of officers within council, but also for elected members who are going to have to make some pretty tough decisions going forward. We've also got into a partnership with some of our innovation centres in Scotland, again thinking things like the built environment and how we do need to absolutely exploit new and emerging technology and different approaches. So we're in a partnership with the Build Environment Innovation Centre here in Scotland. So we've been making that progress as a city, notwithstanding there have been recently a number of reports, particularly through the Parliament and through the Climate Change Committee, that have been critical about the progress that's not been made, and a sense that actually Scottish Government and local government has not been working as well and as coordinated as it could be. So through the work of the Scottish Cities Alliance, that's led to a really good discussion about how to improve the coordination. So we're in the midst now of trying to develop and agree a new set of coordination, and I guess given the nature of climate change, it's a wicked problem, isn't it? And I think the humble government report that was produced for Finland said, in these kind of wicked issues, you have to do things in a really different way, a really deliberate way, and a really deliberate, coordinated way, and that there needs to be learning within the system. Most of our relationships are based on accountability, but a system that's about learning together has to feel and look quite different. So we're on the cusp of agreeing this as a new coordination, and what we're trying to do here is to recognise that at the end of the day everything happens at a place level, But we do need the layers of government above us and their agencies and the knowledge and the expertise that's in there. We do need our scale. Scotland's a small country, so if we're going to attract investment, we're going to have to find a way to kind of coordinate all of that together. So this is an emerging kind of proposal that's developing. So I hope that I've given you a bit of a sense around how we're trying to coordinate within the city, how that coordination now, we've been trying to do that, coordinate with 8 other cities in Scotland, and then how now the deliberate intention is to improve our coordination as 32 local authorities in Scotland with Scottish Government, and hopefully kind of enhance the chance of us achieving in particular the 2030 targets. Chris, I hope I've stuck within time. I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you, Angela. Impeccable on the timing, by the way. You were spot on. And we do have some questions coming in for you. We will hold the questions. I hope that's okay with people too, after we've heard from our speakers, and I can already see there'll be some good discussions at that time. One question I will answer, someone has asked about whether these slide packs will be made available. I think I've checked with all of the speakers, with the exception of potentially Joan, that they're happy for those slides to, thank you, Joan, to be made available to you after the event. Thank you, Angela. I want to move on to Dr. Jessica Stella, the Assistant Director of Reef Health at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. I know a lot of people are really looking forward to hearing from you. Jess, I'm just going to say a little bit about you first. You have a research background on the effects of climate change on coral-reliant animals and have a strong technical knowledge of climate change impacts. And Jess is a highly experienced science communicator specialising in translating science for broad accessibility. I think we'll appreciate that this evening, Jess. She's got a contemporary knowledge of reef science, current condition, and the trend of the outstanding universal values of the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. So very pleased to welcome Dr. Jessica Stella. Good evening.
Good evening, Chris, and good evening to all of our viewers. Thank you for giving up your time to join us and hear about all these different things that we're going to talk to you about tonight. So Chris has already introduced me, and I do work at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, which is a World Heritage listed site. So we are very proud of that. So I just want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners. So we'd like to acknowledge their expertise, wisdom, and enduring connections that have informed the guardianship of the reef for millennia. We pay our respects to the traditional owners as the first managers of this land and sea country. And I'm in Townsville, and that would be the Wilga-Rugaba and Bindle people, and value their traditional knowledge, which continues to inform the current management and stewardship of the reef for future generations. So I'm not sure how much anyone knows about the Great Barrier Reef. It is huge. I think that's probably the first thing I'd like to point out. It's about as big as 70 million football fields, which is roughly the size of Italy or Japan or Germany or Malaysia. So it's 2,300 kilometers long along the eastern coast of Australia, and it hosts a huge diversity of species. We have over 15,000 described species on the reef. And that is across about 3,000 coral reefs, 600 continental islands, and we do have, over 1,500 species of fish, sharks, you name it. We also have a diversity of habitats, so it's not just about the coral reefs. We've got mangroves and seagrass meadows and sandy shores as well. So we have lots of different habitats interlinked in this huge ecosystem. And it's part of Australia's national identity. So we get about 2 million visitors a year, which is amazing that we get to share that reef with so many people. And given it is a coral reef, it is one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world. It comprises about 10% of the world's coral reefs just in this Great Barrier Reef that we've got. So it was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 1981, and we came in on the scene in 1975. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has its own act. We report to the Federal Environment Minister in Australia. So we're not part of that department. We are an independent agency, but we are the lead agency for managing this beautiful and diverse ecosystem. One thing I want to draw attention to, I guess, is because it is a World Heritage Site, we have obligations to report on its condition. And every 5 years, we publish an outlook report. So the last one was 2019, and the next one will come out in 2024. And in that report, we go through each of the values, the outstanding universal values that the Great Barrier Reef was World Heritage listed for, and we assess their condition and their trend and the future outlook for all of the components in the ecosystem. So we look at each of the different habitats, we look at all the different species or species groups, and we also look at the biggest threats to the reef and how that has impacted the reef over the past few years. Now, it's probably no surprise that the major threat is climate change, given that the corals are very susceptible to any increases in temperature, also to pH, so ocean acidification, storm damage. So if there's an increase of storms associated with climate change, there's lots of different individual impacts from climate change that the reef is particularly sensitive to. It's also sensitive to poor water quality from land-based runoff. So we've got agriculture, we've got fertilizers. So when we have floods, and that carries sediments and pesticides and other chemicals out through the waterways, out onto the reef, that can impact coral growth and its distribution as well. There are also impacts from coastal development. So as we modify our coastlines, as humans are really adept at doing, that does all have impacts to the environment. There are also a lot of direct human use impacts to the Great Barrier Reef. Because it is a multi-user marine park, we do allow commercial fishing and recreational fishing research activities, and there's some defense activities that happen within the boundaries of the reef. So a lot of direct human use impacts can impact the reef, but those are managed carefully through a permitting process. Now, given that I've just identified climate change as the biggest threat to the reef, this graph on the right is from the Bureau of Meteorology. So that's Australia's Weather Bureau. And it shows a clear trend from the time records began in the 1900s to where we are current day in 2022, with temperature increases being the trend, at least for the past 50 years. So pre-industrial times, we had a lot lower temperatures. We've had increases that we've never seen before on the Great Barrier Reef, just even in the past 10 years. So temperature extremes that have never been recorded. So we've had the hottest November, the hottest December. Every year we seem to break a record. So sea surface temperatures increasing are really the most immediate and urgent threat to the reef. And it causes coral bleaching, and that is the main impact that we have seen over several years. So that is a photo of some bleached corals on the left. They do sometimes look very pretty. They can fluoresce, they can turn bright white, but ultimately if sea surface temperatures remain too high for too long, those corals will starve to death because they have a symbiotic relationship with algal cells that live in their tissue, and they provide most of their nutrition. If temperatures increase to a point where the algae becomes toxic for the coral spits them out, and then it starts to starve to death. So if sea temperatures aren't too hot or don't last, the hot temperatures don't last too long, those corals can regain those algal symbionts, regain their color, and go back to, I guess, being healthy corals. If they last too long, they will starve to death and die. So we have seen that a few times since 2016. We have had 4 mass bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef. So I know that I've just shown you how big that area is. So imagine hundreds of kilometers of bleached coral reefs. And in 2016, we had particularly high sea surface temperatures, and that is this red bar of the highest bar here on the right-hand side of this graph. So that was the hottest we've ever seen the Great Barrier Reef. It's still currently the record holder. And in that 1 year, we saw coral bleaching that caused about 30% of mortality of the shallow water corals. So shallow water meaning less than 10 meters depth. But that it represents a lot of habitat for fish and invertebrate species. And it does have lag effects for other species as well that recruit onto live coral, so that they need live coral to settle back onto the reef. So we see those immediate impacts of habitat loss, and we also see the lag effects a few years later. Can also have impacts into productive fisheries as well. So trying to manage a reef that size against a threat that we have no direct control over is very, very challenging, given that climate change is a global problem and it requires urgent global action. We are hoping that by using a lot of people use the Great Barrier Reef as kind of the poster child for coral reefs globally, because they're all equally threatened with these increases in sea surface, so temperatures. So even 1 degree above average for 4 to 6 weeks can cause coral bleaching. And in 2016, we saw that happen for several months, I think 13 weeks. So it was a very long marine heat wave that we had. One thing that we do, because we can't manage directly for climate change until we see stronger global action on reducing emissions and other abatement programs being scaled up, we try to control for the pressures that are an immediate threat to the reef that we can control. And one of those is the crown of thorn starfish. So it's a native species to the Great Barrier Reef. It's pictured here. It's got these spines all over it. These are venomous spines. They grow about 1 meter in diameter, so they can get quite large, and they just love coral. So coral is their favorite thing to eat. A lot of them will eat coral exclusively when they become adults, and they can occur in outbreak proportions. So we're not quite sure what causes these outbreaks. They seem to happen in a cyclic manner, so it could be linked to poor water quality, other factors that we can't quite pinpoint, could be a reduction of natural predators. But we do have an ongoing outbreak of crown of thorns starfish along the Great Barrier Reef, mostly in the southern Great Barrier Reef right now. So we actually go out and kill them. So we have a big culling program that we pay several different companies and divers to go out and inject these with household vinegar, and that kills them, and it doesn't pollute the environment. So that's really important as well. So trying to keep the population numbers of these crown of thorn starfish in check is really important to preserve and protect the coral that we can, and that hopefully protects the resilience of the ecosystem, because we've noticed that the ecosystem can recover from disturbances. So even mass bleaching events, even cyclones, it is still quite a resilient system. But if we can boost it or maintain that resilience through the face of climate change, that is our best chance for being able to protect the reef for the future generations, so into the future. So this is one of our shining poster child of how we manage the reef, is deleting all the other pressures that we can. The other tools that we have to manage the reef include our acts and regulations, our zoning plans. So we are a multi-use marine park, so we have to manage all the different activities, including commercial fishing, recreational boating and fishing, diving, research. We do that through permits. So we have a environmental assessment program that looks at the impacts of different activities and does a risk assessment on how likely they are to cause any damage to the ecosystem. So we do permit activities, including tourism. So we have pontoons set out on the reef that stay there permanently. So when tourism boats go out, they have a nice steady platform to put people because they can get quite seasick in the trip out there. And we also have a compliance program, and that looks to enforce that zoning plan, making sure that people are doing the right thing in the right area and not, say, fishing in a no-take marine area or poaching species that they're not allowed to take. So we do have some specific species that are protected that are no-take, and then others that we allow take. There's bag limits and other things that are managed through a joint program, both with Queensland Fisheries as well as the Queensland government. We do work a lot with our traditional owners. So we have TUMRA agreements, which are the traditional use of marine resources. And that allows traditional owners to maintain their sea country, continue with cultural activities that they have done for thousands of years. And we work really closely with them to exchange knowledge and help co-manage. So we do prefer that they manage, they have a really place at the table managing the Great Barrier Reef. We do a lot in education and community awareness. So similar to what we're doing now, but trying to reach out to global communities, school groups, and educate them about the reef and how resilient it is, but also the challenges that it faces going forward. We do have a lot of research stations on the reef, and we've had world-class research happening. We've got universities scattered along the reef, and a lot of them have been working there for 30, 40 years. No, it doesn't sound like a lot probably to people in Scotland, but that's a long time for us. So we have some good baseline data on the reef as well. And a lot of reporting. So we have a huge network of volunteers that report in through the Eye on the Reef network. That's what we call it. And they are able to report anything that they see out on the reef at any time and submit photos as well. So we can map those and look at distribution of animals. So we did find a dwarf minke whale aggregation site through this data. That's consistent. It happens every single year in the same place. And that was discovered by people reporting it back to us when they've been out in the water. We've had a recent sighting of orcas in the Northern Great Barrier Reef. So it is a really, really cool network, and it's just reported through on an app. So it really gets people involved. All of those things go into a more adaptive management. So looking at how threats change over time and what we can actually do to manage them in order to protect the resilience of the reef as best we can going into the future. And hopefully that will buy more time until the world kind of kicks it up a notch with stronger action on climate change. So I would just like to thank everyone for watching.
Thank you, Jess. That's really interesting. There's already some questions coming for you that you might like to take a moment over the next few minutes to have a look at, which we'll come to in our Q&A section. But that's fascinating to hear about the work that you're doing there as part of the authority. Thank you. We need to move on and hopefully get all of these presentations in before question time. And we're heading to Ireland now, where Joan Martin is waiting for us. Joan is the CEO of Louth County Council, has worked in local government in Ireland for nearly 45 years, following a short period in the civil service, has been the CEO there at Louth since September 2014, and was a Director of Services previously, looking after infrastructure, environment and planning. And Louth has been at the forefront of efforts to reduce energy consumption in local authorities for many years, with Joan taking a keen personal interest in the council's climate action activities, which is what we're going to hear about now. So Joan, thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Thanks, Chris. So we're going from the ginormous barrier reef that we've heard about there to a tiny, tiny country called Ireland that people sometimes don't even know where it is, to the smallest county in Ireland, where you can travel from one end of the county to the other in less than an hour. But outside of Dublin, which is our capital city, County Louth, where I work, is the most densely populated county in Ireland, with big urban centres by Irish standards. I I assure you. A lot of what I'm saying will echo what you heard from Scotland, because we're all traveling the same journey all over the world, but particularly around this part of the world, we're kind of on a similar trajectory. We might be at different stages in the story. So just to set it again in context, we follow on from EU. Ireland is in the EU, so we get EU international agreements. So the protocols, Kyoto and Paris and all of those, obviously, we're all following from those. But we have a very strong legislative framework from Europe, and our headline targets for both 2030 and 2050 are set by Europe. So we are kind of being guided from the top. At a national level, then we have our own legislation, compulsory targets, and Ireland has a strong green element in government at the moment. So they're trying to push things on quicker. And we have National Climate Action Plan at a national level that's been reviewed, including with a national dialogue with people and representative groups from all over the country. So they hold an annual consultation and a national dialogue on climate, because awareness and buy-in is obviously hugely important. At a regional level, then, we have a strategy that again is compulsory, but also at a regional level, just to touch at the end of Angela Scott's presentation, we have in place a regional shared service, we call it, structure, where there's a regional climate action office that coordinates and advises and does research and so on behalf of both government and all the local authorities. So we have that structure that Angela's keen on. It's one of the places where we are ahead. Many places we're far behind, but we are ahead on that. And that regional structure has, in the last couple of years, trained pretty much every local authority member of staff and elected councillor in climate action to some level, depending on the work they do. So we've all had climate action training. Thousands and thousands of people have been trained online, done wee tests and quizzes and everything. So that's kind of, again, trying to set the right behaviour in people. So at a local level, then, we have a climate action plan, which originally was about adaptation, and we're now adding mitigation into that at the moment. We have a new plan. Our county development plan, which is a spatial management plan, is a key part of how we're going to drive the type of change that we need. And then we have, again, some of what Angela was talking about. Our local economic and community plan is a multi-agency, multi-stakeholder plan covering economic and community activities, including climate. So moving on to some of the stuff that our county development plan would have, the kind of policies that we've put in our new plan about near zero energy building standards. So trying to ensure that new houses, new buildings, new factories are not continuing to contribute to building up our carbon footprint. We don't want any more additions to it. So about innovative new designs and retrofitting standards that will contribute to reducing our carbon footprint as big as possible. Compact growth within towns and villages to stop sprawl out and that demand on resources and effect on the environment. Increase building heights in towns, again, to stop our towns sprawling and eating up more and more of the countryside and damaging biodiversity and everything. Climate proofing new tourists. Again, this is all about trying to ensure that everything we do from now on, we're not making the problem worse. So whatever we have to deal with, but let's not repeat our mistakes. About small scale wind energy. So moving from big commercial to smaller things, solar and wind, even in villages, which can help in the village, but also maybe the surplus energy, they can sell it onto the national grid. The use of heat pumps, not as much talk about hydrogen here in Ireland. It's been looked at, but a lot of stuff is about heat pumps. So where we wouldn't have a district heating on hydrogen, we're trying to get more and more people to either do the heat pump right out of the ground where you drill down, or the air transfer style. And a lot of support for projects about converting biomass. In fact, I have a big planning application in my county at the moment for a biomass to energy plant. So some of the things that we're doing now, some of the bigger things that we're facing at the moment. So I was telling Chris about this particular one. sea level rise, and Jessica talked about that, and so did Angela. Sea level rise and models around that are obviously a big challenge. The town I'm in today, Dundalk, 40,000 population, which is very big by Irish standards. There's 1,800 houses in this town on the model that face flood risks. So a seawall defence has to be built because you can't move all those people and all those houses. We're doing huge energy retrofitting on social housing. We have about 4,000 social houses, but all over the country, there's a plan to reduce, to retrofit about 1 million houses to a much higher energy standard. And I was reading only this morning that those who are at that higher energy standard used 50% less electricity than other houses in Ireland last year. Our public buildings, we have a big job to do. I'll touch on that again. And decarbonisation, again, what Angela was talking about, working with multi-agencies in our towns and our cities to get everybody to reduce their carbon footprint. Active travel, again, huge investment in Ireland on this modal shift out of our cars onto at least public transport, but walking and cycling. And there's cycle paths and cycleways crawling out of our ears at the moment. They're building them so fast, and there's so many plans for them. So we're trying to do a huge shift in public behaviour. So that's just an example of that. Some of the smaller stuff that we're at all the time, we've had an energy team in Louth probably for about 15 years trying to reduce our energy use. Our target for 2030 is 51%, and Louth is probably at about a 48% reduction already. So it's an area, it shows when you put the effort in, you put the time in, you put people on it, dedicated staff, that you can achieve things. So all the targets are frightening, overwhelming, absolutely scary, but when you tackle them systematically, it is doable. We can do this. We have now a climate action team, so looking at biodiversity, at community action, at trying to coordinate actions across the sectors. There's a huge project underway to convert all our public lighting on our roads, in our towns and our villages over to LED, and that will make a huge contribution to reducing Ireland's use of electricity and our carbon footprint. Sustainable energy communities, so individual communities getting involved. We've one small village that has converted nearly every house to much more sustainable energy. They've worked with every business. They're being held up as an international example within Europe. So you're trying to work at every level. Tidy towns, so the people who do, picking up litter and putting out nice flowers, they are all involved. Green schools, what started out as a kind of an encouragement to pick up litter in schools and to be good, is now very much about climate. So you're at every level, you're trying to make inroads. We've joined, Louth is one of only 5 Irish councils that have joined this EU emissions. And the EU emissions is the EU trying to support all the regions. And again, it's about best practice. So where we do a lot of that within Ireland, this is another layer that gives us access to best practice right across Europe. And that's very, very valuable, that you're not working off a blank sheet of paper, and that you're using the learning and the either the good things or the bad things that other people have done to learn what's the quickest way to move forward. So the EU targets, particular things that we're worried about at the moment are this near zero energy. So the energy performance of buildings, and I've talked about that, particularly around housing. But we also have to, we have a target of 75% of public buildings, that's right across the public sector, have to be brought to a much, much higher energy standard by 2050. And we're saying we need to do 1 building every year. We've 38 buildings and we're underway. So if you go on there, you'll see an example of one of the buildings that we're working on at the moment. A lot of our buildings are old. Local government in Ireland is over 100 years old. So like this building is an old courthouse, but not only am I trying to retrofit it, I also have a separate legal obligation to protect its architectural heritage. So it's a bit like Jessica's trying to watch the World Heritage while at the same time dealing with day to day. So we're trying to protect our architectural heritage, which limits our ability to adapt a building. So you have this kind of conflict all the time in trying to achieve one target versus trying to do another thing. I just wanted to touch a little bit about community, because I know you were particularly interested in about the pressure from communities. So I suppose one of the things we did in 2022 was we held what we called a climate conversation. This was held online with communities. Now, we would have been talking to, we have a system for community representation. So all sectors and groups, voluntary, whether it's tidy towns, whether it's disabled people, young people, whatever, they all have a representation that brings people onto committees. So we would have talked to them about their views. And if you go on to the next slide, this tells you where they think the responsibility lies and who has a role. So you can see there that 80% of them thought that the Irish government should be driving this, and equally the EU. Business and industry, a lot of people see as the people who have to do this, but local authorities are up there, and certainly our government sees local authorities as having a huge role because we're on the ground. We're there with the people, we deal with stakeholders and the public every day. So they feel we have the tentacles into the whole system to begin to make the influence, and we're seen as the champions of change, I suppose. But when you move down through, it's comforting that at least 50% and 23 then thought it was very important. So there you have 85% of people, 75 I can't add, a bit early in the day, 75% of people who thought it was either extremely important or very important that individuals should lead. And I mean, we all know that are in this field that okay governments, okay local authorities, okay individual businesses, but if ordinary citizens don't change their behaviour, if they're not willing to take some of the pain, financial pain and habit pain, get out of my car and walk, that'll be terrible pain for me, or to be more careful about my energy use, all of these things, maybe to think about less holidays, flying or jet setting around Europe. If we don't do that, and it's comforting, I think, as we go down the journey to feel that the public understand that they must act. So for me, these are positive things, and I try to focus on those and not get too frightened by the challenge. There are economic challenges, and it is difficult for me to find money in my budget to electrify my fleet, to retrofit the building, despite government grants and all of that. It is a pain, but I suppose the way I look at it is, it's the law. So it has to be done. And the way I look at it also is, we have a duty, as we all say all the time. I stood in front of our Young People's Council yesterday, and we have a duty to them. We have a duty to protect the county, the island, the world for them. So there's a moral imperative, there's a legal imperative, and we just get on with it. So I mean, we get money, we get grants, we get a lot of grants. The Irish government seems to be slightly full of money at the moment. We're doing quite well despite everything, and there are a lot of grants that come out at all kinds of levels, and this is a community climate action grant, so we'll be able to give grants to communities to do projects in their towns and villages. You can see there grants from as low as, well, hardly anybody would take €1, but grants of say 20,000 up to grants of 100,000 to do projects in their towns and villages. So that's all positive, and it encourages people, and I think people will have to be encouraged. I think there's far too much doom and gloom stories, far too much scaring going on and telling people that the end is nigh, and then people might throw up their hands. And I feel Irish people are up for this, and I feel confident that we can drive this agenda. People like us who are committed and who see the point. Belinda, I think I might have a goodbye slide that I want to show you, because it says Gora Maigat, which is thank you, Ascélaga in Irish. So just to put a little bit of our own culture into it. And thanks very much for listening to me. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Joan. Could you just say that again? That what was that phrase?
Gora Maigat.
Lovely.
Gora Maigat. That's may good be with you. So
excellent.
Thank you. So
thank you very much,
and
thank you for your presentation. Fascinating. There's so much in that, and we do have some questions for you. And I'm getting a little bit concerned that we won't have time to get through everyone's questions because there's quite a few there. So let me move on to our last speaker, who I'm really keen to hear his thoughts on what he's heard this evening from those three very different presentations. Professor John Thwaites is a professorial fellow at Monash University, chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute and the Climateworks Centre and the McKinnon Institute for Political leadership. He was Deputy Premier of Victoria from 1999 until 2007 and held various ministerial portfolios during that time, including being Victoria's first Minister for Climate Change, and I think the first minister to have the climate change responsibility in the entire country, actually, and had portfolios of social policy, health, environment, and water. So much in there. John, it's terrific to have you with us. And firstly, I'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections on what you've heard this evening.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And Chris has asked me to give a bit of an overview, having heard from our great speakers, and really address the question of how to approach climate action in local government in a permacrisis. That is, when local government is facing all of these other issues, how should it be approached? Well, I mean, the first thing to say, and Joan said it, we have to do it. Like, there is no question. As she said, partly it's the law in the EU, but more importantly, it is a moral duty we have to our children, to future generations, to do whatever we can to keep the climate at a safe level. And we have to act fast. And I would be saying we need to keep the 1.5 degree objective to the fore. And the talk that Jessica gave about the Great Barrier Reef highlights that, because people may well be aware that the IPCC report in 2018 on 1.5 degrees indicated that if global warming reaches 2 degrees, almost all coral reefs will be destroyed. At 1.5 degrees, we keep about 30%. So, there's a very practical reason for us to set a high ambition. And that's the first point. And in a sense, that links together Jessica's talk about Barrier Reef to what Joan and Angela are doing in their local councils in trying to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. The second point, it's very clear from tonight that local government has a very important role to play. And we've heard, I thought, a great presentation from both Angela and Joan on what their councils are doing, both in adaptation and in mitigation. And all councils need to do that. The third point is, how do you do all this in the face of permacrisis? Councils are very stretched. There are so many problems. There's daily crises. I know as a minister myself, life and government is about crisis. I can remember when I was health minister, yet another front page story in the paper talking about the hospital crisis. And I asked my advisor, what did she think about this? And she said, well, just imagine if they knew the real situation. Because that's what government is, and I would say that it's no excuse that we've got lots of other things on the agenda. But the key to responding to climate change and not being slowed down by the permanent crisis is to have a plan, and have that plan based on goals that are agreed, a plan to get there, and importantly, a system that forces the decision makers to monitor delivery of that plan. And Angela talked about, some of the criticism that had been made in Scotland of the lack of progress. And I don't know the details about that, but I certainly would say there's been criticism in Australia. And often it's not because of a lack of a plan, it's because there hasn't been a sufficient focus on implementation and monitoring by all parties that can have an impact. And councils need to lock that into their planning system to have enough time to really assess and adapt if necessary. If things fall behind, to be able to use adaptive management to then increase resources in a particular area. The terminology that seems to be increasingly used in climate is having a credible transition plan. And viewing what we've seen from Aberdeen and also from Ireland, that seems to me basically what you're doing. When I look at these credible transition plans, I look at it in terms of three letters, S, I, and J. S for sectors, You've got to have a plan for each sector, I for investment, and J for justice. You've got to ensure that the community is treated fairly and brought along with you. And if you don't do that, that's where you're going to see community antagonism, and that's certainly in Australia where things have slowed down. The next point I'd make is to really focus on what councils can achieve and the levers that councils have, but at the same time to collaborate and coordinate with other levels of government. And that's what I thought was fascinating about Angela's presentation. In Australia, many councils have taken quite strong action on climate change. They have very ambitious plans, but they actually don't have the power to implement them. Most Australian councils don't have power over energy, for example. So they've set targets that really couldn't be implemented without partnerships. And, you know, one suggestion I'd make is that council plans should, if possible, not only have local partners, but should be also signed up to by state and national governments. And increasingly, we should have, you know, multi-level government commitments, which we can all agree to and resource. It seems to me that the EU has developed that tradition through Europe in a better way than we have in Australia, where we tend to not have that level of collaboration. The final point that I'd like to make is the importance of close engagement with community. And that's also where this justice points comes in, to make sure that everyone in the community who's affected is adequately looked after. And one, I think, good case of that in Victoria is where we've been closing, or where we are closing, our coal generators. We've put in place in the Latrobe Valley a transition authority to work with all the affected workers and to try to ensure that they get work and that there's a future for them. But this is going to apply in the coal fields right across Australia. And unless we have a national approach that delivers a just transition, we won't get the transition. Local government has a role, state government has a role, and the national government. But also in terms of community engagement, I also want to highlight the importance of understanding behaviour change. This is where a lot of problems arise. And in my time as a minister, it's what I really learned, that if you don't understand behavioural science and what motivates people, you won't get far. I was Minister for Environment and Climate Change and Water. While I was Minister, we managed to get a reduction in water use of more than 40% per head, which was extraordinary. However, we got almost no reduction in energy use. We had an advertising campaign for both. You know, why is that we were successful in one and not in the other? And essentially it's because people were personally committed and emotionally connected to reducing water use because they saw the consequence of drought, whereas energy was something that was intellectual and theoretical and they didn't really relate to. So I'd urge councils to consider behaviour and behavioural science as they undertake this really important engagement with the community. And they're the points that I thought I'd make.
John, you've just reminded me of something. I think it was you at the time around that promoting water conservation that made the comment about when you have your morning shower, make sure it doesn't go any longer than an average song. That was you, wasn't it? On the radio?
Look, I'll take credit for it.
I can remember you saying that, and it still sticks in my mind. I did have one question for you before we go to Q&A, and it's something we did discuss very briefly prior to this panel. This concept of permacrisis, it hasn't really permeated our discussion this evening, but do you think it's helpful for us to have a word like that that gives the connotation that it does?
No, I don't. And it can be used as an excuse for not acting. I'm also not particularly keen on the framing of climate as a climate emergency and the climate crisis. In many cases, it really is a replacement for action. You know, you feel good, you say, we've declared a climate emergency. All right, what have you done? And it's a good example of not taking sufficient account of behavioral science, because we know that if you scare people, yes, sometimes it can motivate action, but sometimes it can lead to hopelessness. And there's so much that we can do in climate which is a benefit for people. And in Australia, we now have 10% of all of our electricity supplied on household roofs through solar PV. We're the biggest supplier of renewable energy via solar PV, I think, in the world per head. We haven't done it because Australians are concerned about climate change. We've done it because people were convinced that it made sense for them to do that. And so I think it's important that we sell the benefits of clean, green action for ordinary people, not put it in a context of the end of the world is nigh, because I think that can lead to negative responses.
Thank you, John. I'm seeing some agreement from the panelists. I wonder whether any of the other panelists would like to add any commentary on that last point. Joan?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that last point. I think, you know, permacrisis, we're always in a crisis. I'm 45 years in the public service. We go up and we go down and we go round and round, and we have no recruitment, we have no money, then we have money. You just get on with it. You do what you have to do with what you have at any point in time. And that's the secret of leadership or government, is getting on and prioritizing what has to get done. The other thing I'd like to touch on, I didn't touch because it doesn't affect my county, but we have a big Just Transition programme in Louth, in Ireland at the moment, funded by the EU, where we closed the peat stations, the peat that was taken out of the bogs, and we were running 2 power stations in Ireland. We closed them overnight and stopped the mining of mining, if you want to call it that, of peat from the bogs, and we're now re-wetting the bogs to return them to nature. And the EU are funding a huge programme to retrain people, to improve moving electric buses and all this. There's a whole load of stuff going on. So really interesting stuff. But if you allow a crisis to paralyze you, or allow the frightening scale of what has to be done to paralyze you, you're sunk.
Thanks, Joan. And Angela?
I guess it's everything's interconnected, isn't it? So if we pivot our attitude towards economic growth and pivot that in a way that tries to get balance between that economic growth and that not being done at the expense of the environment, and all of those two things in balance, then I wonder if it kind of flows into then around social justice and the health outcomes that John was referencing. If I look at Aberdeen's history, I mean, economically, it's gone through peaks and troughs which have been determined by the global price for oil. And so it's enjoyed significant periods of really vibrant economic prosperity. That hasn't resulted in social justice. It hasn't resulted in an improved health and well-being, and it certainly hasn't kind of spread that wealth economically. So in my mind, Aberdeen's story is a bit around saying, actually, you can't just singularly pursue economic growth. And our new regional economic strategy is very deliberate in saying we're now trying to get a balance. So it's not about saying we've got an economic strategy that's decoupled from our pursuit of environment. We're now saying in our regional economic strategy, it's about the 3 things being in balance: economy, our environment, and our people and their health and well-being. And so if that's the response to the permacrisis, because we're fighting, as Joan says, we're fighting on all 3 of those fronts. I think the secret strategically is how now we don't put each of those agendas in a compartment, that actually we try and move on that integrated basis. And so there's an improved set of outcomes on all 3 of those fronts rather than one at the expense of other.
Thanks, Angela. That makes sense. And I think Jess would like to add to that as well.
I was just going to comment on what John brought up with the IPCC reports and that 2 degrees of warming versus that 1.5, and that huge difference that it would mean for the persistence of fragile ecosystems such as the Great Barrier Reef. And I think we we do tend to focus on that negative commentary, like 2 degrees and the coral reefs are just going to cease to exist, and that is going to be bad. But limiting warming by any increment that we can is going to be better than letting it run away. So when we do talk to people about what they can do, individual actions, and people feel, oh, it's hopeless, I can't do anything, but they can, and collectively those actions across millions or billions of people will make a huge difference. So even if it's limiting warming to 1.6 or 1.7, that's going to have an enormous benefit versus letting it go to 2 degrees. So every action counts.
Thanks, Jess. Now I'm conscious of time and we do have quite a few questions. So I'm going to apologise at the outset to the audience that we will not get to all of these questions, but we'll see if we can get through a few in the next few minutes. One that came in fairly early, and I think it touched on something you said, Angela, was around engaging the voices of youth in the development and the adoption of your route map at that time. And I wonder whether our panelists have any thoughts about strategies for ensuring a youth voice is included.
Yeah, happy to kick off. So in the immediate aftermath of COP26, building on, and we've been doing similar work to Joan in terms of green flag schools and the voice of children and all the eco committees. We use COP26 to then create a mock COP in the city, and we've got a young person that's the president of that. And in the same way that Joan was describing about how to bring the voice of young people into the chamber in order to hold our politicians to account for the decisions. And naturally, I think young people will go further and faster than perhaps we will as an older generation. So we've tried to just add that layer on top of, I guess, the movement that children are doing instinctively themselves, aren't they, within schools and within their families. I think the influence, and particularly in our empowering, and to the point that John made, it's about behaviours, and that's really what our empowerment strategy is about, how we influence the behaviours. I think COVID is going to reveal about how we need to ratchet up the behaviour strategies going forward. I think we've learned a lot from COVID about the use of that as an approach for influencing. But we certainly, John, Chris, we've been layering that voice of children, building it through schools and communities, and then right up into to the decision-making structures of council. So yeah, that's quite a shift.
Thanks, Angela. And Joan, I think you mentioned you were speaking to a youth council just very recently about some of your activities. Do you care to elaborate on that?
Yeah, we have, every county in Ireland has a junior council. We call it Corlin and Og, which is literally the young person's council. And they were presenting to one of the ministers yesterday, one of the Green ministers in the government. They were presenting their annual consultation report. And I mean, climate is one of the areas that young people are absolutely interested in. Now, they're also interested in lots of other things, and they're concerned about safety and drugs and all kinds of stuff. But I mean, climate is obviously something that they're very keen on. And like, these are kids that are now, they're 15, 16, 17, they're in the later years of secondary school. So, I mean, it's really, really important to engage them, because and in Ireland, they're built up. They don't just meet at a local council level, but there's also a national Dáil na nÓg. So they get the opportunity not just to interact in my council chamber, but they get the government. They meet the government, and they're part of the national consultation on climate. So they're brought in at every level, and they've been on the go for a long time. So I was saying this to them yesterday, you've made the breakthrough now, and you are officially recognized as the go-to place to engage with younger people. And that's a great step forward, because it means that not only are they concerned and are they going to influence their own families and communities, but they're influencing right up to government level and EU level. They're in there at every level. Now, okay, they do move very fast, Angela, and they're in a fierce hurry, and they don't see all the barriers that we see, some of which are real barriers, but that's no harm to be pushed by them. And I was delighted yesterday to get a chance to encourage them and to tell them how important they are and how much we're listening to the voice, and how I was taking the report back to my desk, and I scanned it to my management team yesterday for our agenda next week to see what we can respond to. So we must, but in listening to them, we must respond, because they will lose very quickly. So when you ask people for their opinion, it can't be just a box ticking. But the young people, like those young people are, as I say, on the cusp of adulthood. They will be in jobs like mine. They'll be here working in the council in a few years, and we need them. They're studying at university. Dr. Jessica will appreciate this. They're coming in here with expertise and academic knowledge in maybe behavioural change and communication, John, or in climate and biodiversity. And we need those people, and we need them to stay engaged. But we must respond to them, and they must feel that we're doing more than listening. They must.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you to Finbar for that question. I want to try and squeeze in a question from Lynette, who is wondering about how you foster appetite for change in citizens. Makes the point that there's cases in Australia of people mobilising to block change, and interested particularly from an Aberdeen and a Louth point of view, whether that's an issue for you and how you manage that risk.
Oh, sure it is. I mean, you get an application in for a wind farm or a solar farm. Oh, you can be sure the NIMBYs, not in my backyard, will crawl out of the woodwork, and they'll say, even the councillors will say, oh, we want, you know, they all want it, but when there's local opposition, things change a bit. But you just keep going, and you do have some bad stories. We had a wind farm in the west of Ireland, and I think it was the way they constructed it, and the land, there was land slippage and big amounts of land slippage as a result of it. And people are a bit scared about some of the things, but I think we just have to not lose focus and not lose our drive. And it's usually a very small minority. And sometimes those protests are driven by people from outside the area even, and they're influencing local people. But people have to be assured that any application, whether it's solar or biomass, I saw a question about that, or wind, that us as the planning authority or the Environmental Protection Agency in giving it a license are properly and diligently and thoroughly investigating every aspect of the application to make sure it's to the right standard and that it won't damage the environment or something. But there's always naysayers. I mean, it's a very old word, naysayers, because there's always those people, and you can't let them drag your whole purpose down and your whole vision down. You just can't.
Yes, I wonder whether Lynette's talking about, we've seen a rise recently of some very active right-wing groups that are disrupting council processes and opposing things like 20-minute neighbourhood concepts, etc. Have you seen anything like that in your part of the world, Angela?
I think there's an understanding, Chris, in Aberdeen and the communities about how dependent the economy and therefore everybody's livelihood has been on fossil fuel. You know, the amount of jobs that spin out both directly in terms of supply chain, but also the service industry. And the industry here has been transitioning for a long time before it probably became popular or in the media to talk about it. And so, you know, our Indigenous communities have been employed by these companies and have been part of the companies making the economic transition as well as the environmental transition. So, you know, everybody in Aberdeen can find a connection to energy in one route or another. And therefore, I think there's a fundamental understanding and a desire to support the transition, but fundamental understanding about that transition. John's words around it needs to be just, because if it's not a just approach in Aberdeen, then in terms of employment, that will absolutely devastate our kind of communities here. So I think there's a natural understanding that's maybe a bit more sophisticated than other places, Chris, around understanding that the transition needs to happen, and it needs to happen in a really kind of careful way. And we've had lots of innovations. So if I go back to when the kind of first wind farm took place in the city, there's an understanding that transitions had to take place, and it's been very gradual from an economic point of view. And I think there's an understanding, if I just take that the energy transition zone. You know, some of that is in backyards. It's, you know, that it's not without comment and some resistance. But I think fundamentally the understanding about the need to support the industry in making that transition. So I think we have an advantage, John, and you know, the industry's been here since 1960. We've largely been an economy that's singularly been dependent on that industry. So I think there's a level of knowledge and understanding that actually we've got to support, but we've also got to support the industry to make that transition. And I guess the Ukraine position has put into sharp focus the need for security, energy security. And again, I think that's why the population are really supportive of the ScotWind leasing round and the expansion of wind, again, understanding the need for security. So I think the history of Aberdeen puts it in a different place. Again, everybody, when you come to the city, everybody would talk about the oil price. So there's a real understanding of energy, the industry, but its need to transition, and that for every family in the city, that needs to be done in a really just and fair way. So I would say we're slightly different, Chris, than other areas because of that history.
Thanks, Angela. And I think John would like to make a comment on that also.
Assistance with the transition is critical. And we need to recognise that some people will be negatively impacted, and it's quite sensible and reasonable for them to seek to oppose the transition or slow it down unless they can see some future for themselves and their families. And it takes a lot of really slow and long work to enable a trust to build for those people to support institutional approaches. So in Australia, I think we're now seeing the trust is building in some of these areas, and the Australian government is setting up the Net Zero Economy Authority, which will oversee this transition. And on that authority, there are unions, there'll be people who can represent the community, but their task is to ensure that the communities are supported and brought along with them on this big transition. And I was fascinated in the map that Angela had of all those offshore wind. You know, that's going to be a huge economic driver, and it's the same for many communities in Australia. Presumably that will be connected up to onshore hydrogen and industrial hubs, which is a huge transition, and local government can get a lot out of that and needs to be a key player in enabling it.
Thank you, John, for that. We have gone over time, so we're going to need to bring this to a close. Unfortunately, there's a few questions left on the board there, but maybe we can find a way to get some answers through to our attendees from our panelists at a later stage. So I do want to just go around the room and say thank you in order of our speakers to Angela Scott, CEO from Aberdeen City Council. Lovely to have you here again, Angela. We've had Dr. Jessica Stella from the Great Barrier Marine Reef Authority. Thank you, Jess, for your presentation this evening. Joan Martin from Louth County Council in Ireland, and John Thwaites from Monash and the former Minister for Climate Change. I like saying that, the first one in Australia, let alone Victoria. John, great to have you with us this evening as well. Lots of little applause icons coming from our audience for you all. And just to confirm, yes, that those slide presentations will be made available to the attendees. I know a few of you have asked, so Belinda, I'm sure, will take care of that. And that just leaves me to thank Belinda Ryan very much for her hard work behind the scenes to bring all this together this evening, and to the rest of the team at the VLGA and the LGIU. Unfortunately, Catherine Arndt, the CEO of the VLGA, couldn't be with us this evening as she is travelling, but I know she would have loved to have said a few words to thank you all for your contribution this evening. And we couldn't have Jonathan from LGIU with us this evening either, but he would have loved to have done the same. So I pass on my thanks on behalf of those two organisations. So thank you all for joining us. The webinar will be made available to members of both organisations through the YouTube channel in the coming days. Keep an eye on your email for details about that. That just leaves me to say a thank you to all of our audience for coming along and joining in the webinar this evening, and we hope to see you at another Global Executive Panel again very soon. Until then, bye for now.